The first dish came back untouched. Sous Chef Veloneer set the plate on the return counter with a sound like a verdict, ceramic on steel, final and flat, and the entire kitchen staff of Diplomatic Station Corinthia went quiet. 23 Valori cooks in their pale blue service tunics stopped chopping, stopped stirring, stopped breathing, because they all knew what an untouched plate from the ambassador's table meant. It meant the Cella-3 envoy had refused the food. It meant 6 months of trade negotiations were sitting on a razor's edge, because the most important guest on the station had pushed away his meal without lifting a utensil. Veloneer's silver-white hands were trembling. She was tall, even for a Valori nearly 7 feet, with the high cheekbones and faintly luminous lavender skin that marked her caste. Her eyes, large and pale violet, swept the kitchen with the look of someone calculating exactly how many careers would end by morning. "The Cella-3 envoy," she said, her voice controlled to a fine edge, "has declared the third course unfit for consumption." He used the word insulting. He said the flavor profile demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of his species' palate, and that if this is the best the Valori diplomatic service can produce, perhaps the trade summit should be relocated to a station with actual culinary capability. Nobody spoke. The kitchen hummed with the ambient sound of thermal regulators and circulating ventilation. Somewhere near the back wall, a stock pot bubbled. Alara Dunn, standing at the sanitation station in her gray coveralls with her sleeves rolled past her elbows, kept scrubbing the heavy roasting pan she'd been working on for the last 10 minutes. She was the only human on the station's kitchen staff, technically not even on it. Her classification was Mess Hall Auxiliary Species, Terran Clearance, Subsurface Level Maintenance and Sanitation. She washed dishes. She hauled supply crates from the cargo elevator. She scrubbed the floor grates at the end of every shift. She had been doing it for 14 months, ever since she'd signed an off-world labor contract and shipped out from a small restaurant town on Earth's southern coast, because the pay was 4 times what she'd made running the line at Marchetti's back home, and her mother's medical bills weren't going to shrink on their own. She was 31 years old. She had rough hands and short dark hair and a burned scar on her left forearm from a grease fire when she was 19. She had spent her entire adult life in kitchens, not alien kitchens, not diplomatic kitchens, not the vast automated food processing centers that the Valori considered the pinnacle of culinary engineering, but real kitchens. Small ones. Hot ones. Kitchens where you could hear the oil snap and feel the radiant heat off a cast iron pan, and smell whether the garlic had turned before the timer went off. She'd cooked at Marchetti's for 9 years, head of the line for the last 4, and before that she'd cooked at a diner in her hometown. And before that she'd cooked for her grandmother, who had taught her everything that mattered about food before Alara was 12 years old. None of that mattered here. Here she was the dishwasher, the crate hauler, the floor scrubber. The Valori kitchen staff looked through her the way you look through furniture. She did not take it personally. She had been invisible in kitchens before. The work was honest and the pay was steady, and she sent money home every cycle. But she had ears. And she had been listening to the kitchen's problems for weeks. The Cella-3 delegation had arrived 9 days ago, and since then the kitchen had been in quiet crisis. The Cella-3 were a species Alara had never encountered before coming to Corinthia, tall, angular, with deep bronze skin, and a complex secondary palate located in the roof of their mouths that processed what they called tonal flavor, a dimension of taste that most other species couldn't perceive at all. Their cuisine was built on layered flavor harmonics. A dish wasn't just sweet or savory or bitter, it was a chord. Multiple flavor notes sounding simultaneously, the way 3 notes make a triad in music. A dish that hit a Cella-3 palate with only 1 flat note, the way most galactic cuisine did, was the equivalent of someone playing a single key on a piano and calling it a symphony. The Valori chefs had been trying to crack it since the delegation's arrival. They had consulted databases, imported specialty ingredients from 3 systems, run flavor mapping algorithms through the station's culinary computer. They had produced 9 formal courses over 8 days, each one a painstaking attempt to recreate the tonal flavor profiles documented in the Cella3 Culinary Index, a reference text that described the harmonic relationships between their major ingredient families. Every one had been rejected. The first 3 had been sent back with polite diplomatic language not quite aligned with our preferences. The next 3 had drawn increasingly specific criticism. The upper register is absent. The bass note overwhelms the harmonic. There is no resolution. The 7th and 8th had been returned without comment, which was worse. And now the 9th, prepared by Velanier herself, the most senior chef on the station, a woman who had cooked for 3 trade summits and a royal inauguration, had come back untouched with the word insulting attached to it. Alara scrubbed the roasting pan and listened to the silence. She knew what the problem was. She had known for 5 days. She had figured it out the same way she'd figured out why Mrs. Andrelotti's risotto never came out right at the diner in Shearwater, by watching and tasting and thinking about what she was tasting, not what the recipe said she should be tasting. She had been clearing the plates that came back from the Cella3 table, and the Valori threw them straight into sanitation without a second look, because to them, a rejected plate was waste. But Alara had paused each time and tasted what was left. Not on the tip of her tongue, on the back. And she had tasted what the Cella3 computer index could not tell you, because it was a thing you had to feel in your mouth and in your memory. The dishes were hitting 2 notes, not 3. They were dyads, not triads. The Valori were layering primary and secondary flavors perfectly, but they were missing the 3rd voice, the one the Cella3 called the undertone, the deep slow note that sat beneath the other 2 and gave the chord its emotional weight. It was the bass line, the root note, the thing that made a Cella3 dish feel like it meant something, rather than just tasting correct. The Valori couldn't hear it because their palates didn't process undertone. They tasted 2 dimensions of flavor, the same as humans, and they were layering those 2 dimensions with extraordinary skill. But a 2-dimensional chord is a dyad. A Cella3 palate wanted a triad, and no amount of algorithmic flavor mapping was going to bridge that gap because the gap wasn't in the ingredients. It was in the cook. Alara knew this because she had spent 3 evenings alone in the auxiliary pantry after her shift, working with the station's ingredient stock, tasting and adjusting and thinking. Humans couldn't taste undertone either, not the way the Cella3 did, not through a secondary palate. But Alara had been cooking by instinct her whole life, and instinct was just another word for the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 small adjustments made without thinking. She had discovered on the 2nd evening that certain combinations of Cella3 base ingredients, a particular fermented root paste, a mineral salt derived from Cella3 river sediment, and a slow-reduced bone stock made from a creature she couldn't pronounce the name of, produced something she could feel even if she couldn't technically taste it. A resonance in the back of her throat, a depth, a hum. It was the undertone, translated into a frequency that a human palate could sense as texture rather than flavor. She had learned to cook by texture when she was 9 years old, standing on a step stool beside her grandmother's stove, and her grandmother had told her, "You don't just taste the food, Alara, you listen to it." She could hear the 3rd note. Velanier was at the head station, her back rigid, scrolling through the Cella3 Culinary Index on her display terminal. Around her, the junior cooks were pretending to work while stealing glances at each other, communicating in the silent way that kitchen staff everywhere communicate when they know the head chef is about to crack. One of the junior cooks, a young Valori named Heathen with pale blue-white skin and large, uncertain eyes, cleared his throat. "Chef Velanier, perhaps if we adjusted the mineral content in the reduction." "I adjusted it 4 times. Velanier didn't look up. "I adjusted everything. The index specifies 7 primary harmonics for formal dining. I have hit every one. The computer confirms it. The spectral analysis confirms it." Every measurable parameter is within tolerance. Then perhaps the envoy is simply difficult. Velinir turned. Her eyes were hard. Heathen, the envoy is not being difficult. He is tasting what we are cooking, and what we are cooking is incomplete. A Valori who served two-dimensional food to Valori guests would also be called insulting. The problem is not his standards. The problem is that we are deaf to something he can hear, and until we cure that deafness, every plate we send will come back exactly as this one did. She gestured at the untouched plate on the return counter. The food on it was beautiful, arranged with the geometric precision that the Valori brought to everything they did, colors balanced, textures layered, a small architectural triumph of culinary engineering. It was also, to the person it was meant for, silence pretending to be music. He then looked at the floor. The other junior cooks went back to pretending they were working. Velinir turned back to her terminal. The kitchen settled into the particular misery of a crew that has tried everything and knows it hasn't been enough. But the misery was not allowed to settle for long. The kitchen doors swung open 30 seconds later, and Station Commander Rithvan walked in, a broad-shouldered Valori with iron-gray skin, and the clipped bearing of someone who had spent his career making problems disappear through organizational pressure. He did not cook. He did not understand cooking. He understood timelines, and the timeline was crumbling. "Chef Velinir," he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of command. "The Selethri delegation has communicated to my office that unless tomorrow evening's banquet demonstrates a fundamental change in approach, the envoy intends to recommend the trade summit be suspended indefinitely. Suspended, chef, not postponed. Do you understand what that means for this station?" "I understand what it means, Commander." Velinir's voice was level, but Alara could see the faint tremor in her silver-white fingers where they rested on the terminal edge. "Then I need a solution. Not another attempt. A solution. I've allocated emergency procurement authority. Whatever ingredients you need from whatever system, I can have them here within 8 hours. But I need you to tell me what to order, because right now my intelligence staff is telling me the Selethri trade route is worth 900 billion in annual commerce to the three-system alliance, and I am looking at the person responsible for not losing it." He said it without cruelty. That was almost worse. He was stating a fact the way you state altitude to a pilot in a dive, clear, calm, and inescapable. Velinir looked at him. "Commander, I have exhausted the Selethri culinary index. I have replicated every recommended technique, sourced every specified ingredient, consulted every database accessible to this station. The problem is not procurement. The problem is that our species does not possess the physiological capacity to perceive a dimension of taste that the Selethri consider fundamental to their cuisine. Ordering more ingredients will not give us a new palate." Commander Rithvan was silent for a moment. He looked around the kitchen, at the 23 cooks who would not meet his eyes, at the untouched plate on the return counter, at the displays showing 9 failed attempts over 8 days. His gaze passed over Alara at the sanitation station without registering her presence, the way a general's gaze passes over the orderlies when surveying a battlefield. "Then find someone who has the palate," he said. "There is no one on this station with a Selethri secondary palate, Commander. The nearest Selethri colony is 4 transit jumps away. We cannot." "Then improvise." He turned on his heel and walked out. The kitchen doors closed behind him with a soft pneumatic hiss that sounded, in the silence that followed, like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had no good answer. Velinir stood very still for 10 seconds. Alara counted them because she had learned, over 14 months, that the length of Velinir's silences was proportional to the weight of what she was carrying. After 10 seconds, Velinir turned back to her terminal and began scrolling through the culinary index again, because that was what a professional did when there was no answer. You went back to the work and you kept looking. 2 of the junior cooks broke off quietly. Alara watched them through the corner of her eye. They drifted to the corner of the kitchen near the cold stores and began a low, urgent conversation that was clearly not about food. One of them, a slight Velori with pale green-tinged skin named Sarath, glanced toward the exit doors. The other nodded. Alara recognized the body language. She had seen it in every restaurant she'd ever worked in. Two line cooks deciding whether to put in their notice before the next service. The kitchen was coming apart, not with a bang but with the slow loosening of bolts that happens when a crew loses belief. 8 failures had eroded confidence. The 9th, with the word insulting attached, had cracked morale. And the commander's visit, the cold arithmetic of 900 billion in commerce balanced against a dish that nobody knew how to cook, had turned the crack into a fault line. Alara finished the roasting pan. She dried her hands on the towel tucked into her waistband. She stood still for a moment. She should keep quiet. She knew she should keep quiet. She was a dishwasher. She had no standing in this kitchen, no authority, no credentials that the Velori recognized. Her labor classification didn't even allow her into the ingredient stores without escort. If she walked up to Velinir and said, "I know what you're doing wrong," the best outcome was being ignored, and the worst was being reassigned to cargo sanitation on a lower deck. But the summit was in 14 hours. And the final banquet, the one that would seal or destroy the trade agreement that 3 systems had been working toward for 2 years, required a 7-course meal prepared for the Selethri envoy and his delegation. 7 courses, each one a tonal flavor triad, and the best kitchen on the station couldn't produce a single dish the envoy would eat. Alara untucked the towel from her waistband, folded it neatly, set it on the sanitation counter, and walked across the kitchen toward Velinir's station. Conversation stopped as she passed. She could feel the looks, the mild confusion of the Velori cooks at seeing the human dishwasher walking away from her post toward the head station. The way their luminous violet eyes tracked her with the distant curiosity you'd give a cleaning drone that had rolled into the wrong room. She stopped 2 paces from Velinir. Velinir did not look up. "Chef Velinir," Alara said. Velinir's fingers stopped on the terminal. She looked up. Her expression was the Velori equivalent of being interrupted by the weather, not angry, not curious, just briefly aware that something in the background had made a noise. "The sanitation station is behind you," Velinir said. "The floor grates in Section 3 need attention." "Yes, ma'am, they do. But the Selethri dishes are missing the undertone, and I think I can fix it." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence, not the stunned quiet of the rejected plate, but the sharper silence of something that should not be happening. A dishwasher had just told the head chef that she knew the answer. The junior cook stared. He then actually put down his knife. A senior cook named Davorin, who had been working the stock station with the grim focus of a man trying not to be noticed, turned fully around. Velinir looked at Alara for 3 full seconds. Her expression shifted through several things Alara couldn't read and settled on something that might have been measured disbelief. "You are a sanitation auxiliary," Velinir said. "You clean cookware." "Yes, ma'am." "You are telling me you understand Selethri tonal flavor architecture." "I'm telling you the dishes are hitting 2 notes, not 3. The primary and secondary profiles are excellent, but the undertone, the bass note, isn't there. Your palate can't detect it and neither can mine, not directly. But you can build it from 3 ingredients in the Selethri staple stores, and if you get the ratio right, you can feel it in the texture. It hums." "The Selethri Culinary Index does not describe a hum," Velinir said. "No, ma'am, it wouldn't. The index is a reference for Selethri cooks who already have the secondary palate. They don't need to be told what the undertone feels like, the same way a human recipe doesn't tell you what salt tastes like. But if you're building it from the outside, which is what we'd have to do, you need to approach it as texture, not flavor. The fermented kelth root, the mineral salt from their river sediment, and a slow-reduced broth from the stockpot meat they call varihin. Those three, in the right ratio, produce the undertone as a physical sensation. He then whispered something to the cook next to him. Velanir silenced them both with a glance. "How," Velanir said, her voice very controlled, "does a human sanitation worker know this?" "Because I've been tasting the plates that come back." "You tasted the rejected dishes?" "Every one. And I spent 3 evenings in the auxiliary pantry experimenting with the Cella-3 base ingredients. I found the ratio." "I can show you." Velanir looked at Alara for a long moment. Alara could see the calculation behind those luminous violet eyes, the risk of listening to a dishwasher, weighed against the reality that the summit banquet was 14 hours away and every chef on the station had failed. Velanir was proud, but she was not stupid, and Alara had worked under enough head chefs to know the difference between the ones who would rather fail than listen, and the ones who wanted the dish to be right more than they wanted to be right. Velanir stepped back from her station. "Show me." Alara nodded. She walked to the ingredient stores, aware of every eye in the kitchen following her. The cold stores were organized with Valori precision, labeled, temperature-zoned, each species ingredient family in its own compartment. She pulled 3 containers from the Cella-3 section. The fermented kelth root, dark and pungent, packed in ceramic crocks. The Cella-3 mineral salt, gray-white and crystalline, smelling faintly of wet stone. And the raw varihin stock concentrate, dense and dark as old coffee, stored in sealed thermal flasks. She carried them to the nearest open workstation and set them down. Velanir stood to her left. The junior cooks had drifted closer, abandoning even the pretense of working. Davarin had left the stock station entirely and was watching from 3 paces away, his arms folded. Alara ignored them all. She picked up a mixing vessel, a shallow ceramic bowl, and began. The kelth root first. She broke a piece from the crock with her fingers, feeling the texture dense, slightly gritty, with the yielding give of fermented plant matter. She crushed it against the bottom of the bowl with the heel of her palm, working it into a rough paste. The smell that rose was complex, earthy, sour, with a faint sweetness underneath that reminded her of miso. The mineral salt next. She measured it by instinct, a pinch, then half a pinch more, and worked it into the paste with 2 fingers. The texture changed. The paste went from rough to smooth, and she felt the first faint vibration in her fingertips. The varihin stock last. She poured a thin stream from the thermal flask, watching the color change as the dark concentrate met the paste and bloomed into something the color of burnished copper. She stirred with a flat wooden utensil, the closest thing on the station to a wooden spoon, in slow circles, the way her grandmother had taught her to stir a roux, patient, steady, letting the heat of the mixture do the work. The hum began. It was not a sound. It was a sensation, a low, sustained vibration that Alara felt in the bowl, in her fingers, in the back of her throat when she leaned close. It was the undertone, translated into the physical world. The third note of the Cella-3 triad, expressed as texture and resonance. Alara dipped the wooden utensil into the mixture, lifted it, and held it out to Velanir. "Taste this," she said. "Not on the tip of your tongue, on the back, and hold it for a 3 count before you swallow." Velanir hesitated. Then she took the utensil, brought it to her mouth, and tasted. Her expression did not change for 2 seconds. On the 3rd second, her eyes widened, not dramatically. The Valori were not a dramatic species, but enough that every cook in the kitchen noticed. "I feel it," Velanir said. "In the posterior palate, a sustained resonance. That's the undertone. That's what's missing from every dish you've sent to the Cella-3 table." Velanir set the utensil down. She looked at the bowl, at the 3 ingredient containers, at Alara's rough hands with the burn scar visible. Her expression was doing something complicated, the look of a professional reassessing a fundamental assumption about the person standing in front of her. "This is a base," she said, "not a dish." No, ma'am, it's not a dish. It's the foundation, the bass line. Every celery dish needs it underneath the primary and secondary layers, the same way every piece of music needs a key signature. Your dishes are technically perfect. The primary and secondary flavor profiles are beautifully constructed, but without the undertone bass, they're chords without a root. They float. They don't land. Davarin unfolded his arms. How do you know they float? He asked. His voice was careful, not hostile, curious. Because I can feel when something doesn't land. It's a texture thing. You bite down and the flavor's there. It hits the front and the middle, but the back of the mouth is empty. There's nothing underneath. It's like standing on a floor that looks solid, but your feet know it's hollow. Davarin looked at Velinir. Velinir looked at Alara. You are proposing, Velinir said slowly, that we rebuild all 7 summit courses around a base layer developed by a human sanitation worker in the auxiliary pantry. I'm proposing that I show you how to integrate the undertone base into the courses you've already designed. Your dishes are good, chef. They're better than good. They just need the third voice. Velinir looked at her for another moment. Alara held the look. She did not look away, but she did not challenge either. She stood the way she had always stood in kitchens, ready to work, waiting for the word. You have 1 hour, Velinir said. Show me the first course. The next 11 hours were the hardest and the best of Alara Dunn's life. She started with the first course, a chilled consomme that Velinir had designed with a primary note of bright citrus analog and a secondary note of mineral depth. The consomme was elegant, clear as glass, technically flawless. It was also, to a celery palate, a single high note ringing in an empty room. Alara prepared the undertone base fresh and showed Velinir how to fold it into the consomme, not stirred in, folded. Layered at the bottom of the serving vessel so that the first sip carried all 3 notes simultaneously. The bright citrus on the front of the palate, the mineral depth in the middle, and the slow hum of the undertone rising underneath like a cello joining a violin. Velinir tasted it. She closed her eyes. It resolves, she said quietly. The chord resolves. Heathen's hand went up. Chef, may I? Velinir handed him a tasting vessel. Heathen tasted. His eyes went round. He tasted again, holding the liquid in his mouth the way Alara had shown Velinir, and his expression shifted from surprise to something softer, the look of a young cook who has just understood something about food that cannot be taught from a textbook. It has a floor, he said. The flavor has something to stand on. Alara allowed herself a small nod. That's the undertone, ready for the second. They moved to the second course. This was harder, a warm grain preparation with smoked protein and a sharp acidic garnish. The primary and secondary notes were strong, almost aggressive, and the undertone needed to match that energy without overwhelming it. Alara adjusted the ratio, adding more Varihan stock and less mineral salt, thinning the base so it sat beneath the louder flavors like a deep current beneath choppy water. The challenge was in the integration. Velinir's grain preparation was cooked in a sealed thermal vessel at precise temperature for exactly 42 minutes, the Velori way, controlled, repeatable, algorithmic. The undertone base needed to be worked into the grain during the final stage of cooking, and that meant opening the sealed vessel, disrupting the controlled environment, and relying on Alara's feel for when the ratio was right. Velinir did not like this. Her jaw tightened when Alara opened the thermal vessel and the carefully maintained temperature dropped 3 degrees. The protocol specifies. The protocol gives you 2 notes, Alara said, not unkindly. If you want 3, we need to let the food breathe. She worked the undertone base into the grain with her hands, not with a utensil, with her fingers, because she needed to feel the moment when the vibration stabilized. The grain went from dry and precise to something warmer, looser, with a depth that changed the way it felt in the mouth. Velinir tasted it, and her objection died unspoken. He then tasted it and said, "It has weight. The dish has weight now." Davarin tasted it and said nothing, but he pulled a chair up to the workstation next to Alara's and sat down, and did not leave for the rest of the night. The third course took them into unfamiliar territory. A raw preparation, thinly sliced protein arranged in overlapping petals with a delicate aromatic oil. The undertone base in its standard form was too heavy for this dish, too dense. It would bury the delicate primary notes. Alara stood at the workstation for 4 minutes, thinking, while Velanir and 3 junior cooks waited. The clock on the wall counted seconds. 14 hours had become 12. Then she took the kelth root paste and diluted it, not with water, but with the aromatic oil itself, working the fermented root into the fat until the paste became translucent and carried only the faintest vibration. She brushed it onto each slice of protein with her fingertips, the way her grandmother had brushed olive oil onto bread dough, and the dish transformed. The raw protein still tasted clean and bright, but beneath it there was a whisper of depth, a suggestion of the third note, so subtle that it almost felt like memory. "She's not measuring," Davarin observed to Velanir. He said it the way a witness describes something they don't entirely believe. "No," Velanir said. Her voice had changed in the last 2 hours. The controlled edge was still there, but something else had entered it, something that sounded, to Alara's trained ear, like respect finding its footing. "She is not." Alara finished brushing the last slice. "This one needs to be served within 4 minutes of preparation. The oil carries the undertone for about 6 minutes before it dissipates. After that, the dish goes flat." Velanir nodded. "I will notify service." She paused. "The timing is quite specific." "Food is always specific," Alara said. "We just don't always listen to it." The fourth course was the one that nearly broke the kitchen. It was the centerpiece of the banquet, a slow-cooked preparation that required 6 hours of thermal processing, and they were running out of time. Velanir had designed it as the summit's signature dish, a complex layered construction with 7 distinct flavor elements arranged in ascending intensity, each element prepared separately and combined at the table by the service staff in a prescribed sequence. It was ambitious, it was beautiful, and when Alara tasted the prototype, she put the tasting vessel down and was quiet for a long time. "What is it?" Velanir asked. "This dish is fighting itself." The kitchen went still. Velanir's expression hardened. "Explain." "The 7 elements are competing for attention. Each one is excellent on its own. The smoked reduction is remarkable. The crystallized garnish is inspired. But when they come together, they create a wall. A Celithri diner would taste it and feel overwhelmed, the way you feel when someone plays all 88 keys on a piano at once. It's not wrong. It's too much. The banquet protocol requires a centerpiece of sufficient complexity," Velanir said. Her voice was tight. This dish was her creation, her pride, and Alara had just called it too loud. "Complexity isn't the same as volume. 3 voices can be more complex than 7 if each voice is doing something different." Velanir's jaw tightened. Behind her, the junior cooks exchanged looks, the anxious looks of people watching a confrontation between 2 kinds of authority, formal and earned. Alara picked up the wooden utensil. "May I show you what I mean?" A beat, 2 beats. Velanir stepped aside. Alara stripped the dish. She took Velanir's 7 elements and set 5 of them aside. She kept the smoked reduction and the crystallized garnish, the 2 strongest voices, and rebuilt around them. She prepared the undertone base at medium strength, then discovered, almost by accident, that combining 2 of Velanir's discarded garnish elements produced something unexpected, a harmonic overtone, a faint ringing note that sat above the triad like a bell above a choir. Not a flavor, exactly. More like the memory of a flavor, a shimmer. 4 voices, not 7. But each one distinct, each one singing a different part, and when they came together in the mouth, they produced something that Alara felt in her chest, a resonance that traveled from the tongue to the throat to the sternum, the way a piece of music travels from the ear to the heart. "Taste this," she said. Veloneer tasted it. She stood perfectly still for 5 seconds, her eyes closed, her luminous skin faintly pulsing in the way Alara had learned to recognize as strong emotion. When she opened her eyes, her expression was one Alara had never seen on a Velori face. The look of someone whose understanding of what is possible has just been quietly, permanently expanded. "Where did you train?" Veloneer asked. "Marchetti's. Corner of Vine and Harbor Street, Shearwater, Earth." "I do not know this academy." "It's not an academy. It's a restaurant. 40 seats, open kitchen, family-owned. The head chef was a man named Sal Marchetti who could make a risotto that would make you cry, and he never used a thermometer in his life." Veloneer looked at Alara's hands, the rough skin, the burned scar, the short nails, the faint staining from years of work with food and cleaning agents. Hands that did not belong to a culinary engineer. Hands that belonged to someone who touched food for a living, who knew it by feel and by instinct, the way a sculptor knows clay. "You cook by instinct," Veloneer said. "I cook by listening. The food tells you what it needs if you pay attention." Something shifted in the kitchen after that. Not formally, Veloneer gave no order, issued no new classification, made no announcement. But the atmosphere changed the way the atmosphere changes in a kitchen when the head chef finally trusts the line. The tension didn't vanish, it transformed. It became the good tension, the focused kind, the kind that means the crew believes the service is going to work. Sarath, the junior cook who had been eyeing the exit doors an hour ago, came back from the corner and quietly started prepping station Messi in place without being asked. The other cook who'd been whispering about notice followed 30 seconds later. Nobody said anything about it. Nobody needed to. The junior cook stopped looking at Alara as if she were a malfunction and started looking at her the way you look at a colleague. He then moved to the station next to hers and began preparing ingredients before she asked for them, anticipating her needs the way a good sous chef anticipates the head of the line. Davorin, the senior cook, started asking questions, quiet, precise questions about ratio and timing, and the point at which the undertone shifted from too subtle to too strong. Alara answered them all. She had spent her whole life answering questions about food, even when nobody was asking, answering them in her own head, in her own hands, in the 10,000 small adjustments that turned ingredients into a meal. Now someone was listening, and the answers came easily, naturally, like water finding its level. The fifth course came together in 90 minutes, a fermented vegetable preparation with a bright acid finish. The dish Veloneer had originally designed as a showcase for Velori fermentation technique, one of the station's culinary strengths. The flavors were sharp, assertive, confident, the kind of dish that declared its identity on the first bite. Alara's challenge was to add the undertone without softening that confidence. She layered the base at the bottom of the preparation vessel and built upward, so the diner's palate traveled through 3 dimensions of flavor in a single bite. Acid first, then the warm body of the ferment, then the slow hum rising from underneath like bedrock beneath a river. The acid didn't change. The ferment didn't change. But the undertone gave them a foundation, and suddenly the dish felt rooted, grounded in something deeper than its own brightness. Veloneer suggested adding a crumbled grain element for textural contrast. It was the first time she had offered a creative suggestion to Alara rather than asking a question or raising an objection, and Alara recognized the significance. The head chef was no longer supervising a dishwasher's experiment. She was collaborating with a colleague. Alara tried the grain. The texture was right, a subtle crunch against the soft ferment, but the seasoning competed with the undertone. She adjusted it, pulling back the mineral salt on the grain itself so the undertone base could carry that frequency alone, and the dish locked into place with a precision that felt almost musical. Like a quartet finding its final arrangement, each instrument in its register, each voice distinct, the whole greater than the sum. "That's it," Alara said. She could hear the triad in her mouth, all three notes sounding the chord complete. Don't change anything. Veloneer tasted it and made a note on her datapad. She had been making notes all night, not the clinical notation of the Selethri Culinary Index, but detailed observations about Alara's process, her ratios, her timing, the way she adjusted by feel rather than measurement. The notes were extensive. Alara noticed but said nothing. A good head chef always documents. It was a sign of respect, in its way, the acknowledgement that what was happening was worth recording. Heathen, who had been prepping Alara's ingredients with increasing speed and anticipation, paused and looked at the clock. 7 hours down. The 6th and 7th are all that remain. The 6th is going to be tricky, Alara said. It's a bridge, transitional. It needs to carry the palate from the intensity of the 5th to wherever the dessert goes. And right now, I'm not entirely sure where the dessert goes. One course at a time, Davorin said. It was the most words he had said in the last 3 hours, and they were exactly the right ones. The 6th course was a warm broth with suspended aromatics, delicate, complex, designed to cleanse the palate before the dessert. In Veloneer's original design, it had been a straightforward palate cleanser, light, neutral, clearing the way for the final course. But Alara knew from her pantry experiments that a Selethri palate bridge was not neutral, it was a modulation, a key change. It needed to carry the memory of what came before while opening the door to what came next, and that required the undertone to be present but barely there, like the last ring of a bell before the next one strikes. She built the undertone lighter than any previous course, using a fraction of the kelth root dissolved in warm broth rather than worked into a paste. She heated it gently, barely above body temperature, so the fermentation compounds activated slowly, and the vibration emerged not as a sensation but as an atmosphere. The result was barely perceptible, a faint warmth at the back of the throat, a gentle vibration that reset the palate without asserting itself. Less a note than an echo. He then tasted it and frowned. I barely feel the undertone. You're not supposed to feel it, Alara said. It's a bridge. It connects the savory courses to the dessert. If you play it too loud, the dessert has nothing to arrive to. He then looked at her, then at the broth, then back at her. You're thinking of the meal as a single piece of music. Alara almost smiled. Every meal is a piece of music. Most people just don't listen to the whole thing. The 7th course was dessert, and it nearly defeated them. Selethri dessert cuisine operated on a different harmonic system than their savory dishes. Alara had known this theoretically from her pantry experiments, but confronting it with 90 minutes on the clock was different from knowing it in the abstract. The undertone in savory dishes was deep and sustained, a drone, a foundation. In dessert, it was supposed to be light and oscillating, a vibrato rather than a drone. The flavor had to breathe the way the finish of a great wine breathes, expanding and contracting, pulsing with life rather than sitting heavy and still. Alara's standard base didn't work. The kelth root was too heavy, the Varahin stock too dark. She tried having the ratio, still too dense. She tried diluting with the mineral water the Velori used for their own dessert preparations. The undertone vanished entirely, swallowed by the neutral liquid. She tried replacing the Varahin stock with a lighter broth she found in the cold stores. The vibration changed character, went sour, turned into something that sat in the mouth like a wrong note. Heathen was watching her from 2 stations away, not speaking, not offering suggestions, because he had learned in the last 11 hours that Alara worked through problems the way she worked through ingredients, by feel, by iteration, by listening to what wasn't right until she heard what was. But his eyes were on the clock. Davorin at the station to her left broke his silence for the 2nd time that night. How many attempts? He asked. 4, Alara said. None of them are right. What specifically is wrong? Alara paused. She appreciated the question because it was the right question, not can you do it, or should we try something else? But what specifically is wrong? The question of a cook who trusted the process and wanted to understand the obstacle. The undertone needs to oscillate, she said. Breathe. Pulse. But every version of the bass I've tried either sits flat or disappears. I need it to exist in a sustained state of almost not there, present enough to register, light enough to move. Davorin considered this. The Kelth root compounds, they are temperature sensitive, yes. The fermentation products change behavior at different thermal ranges. Yes, Alara looked at him. Yes, they do. Then perhaps the problem is not the ratio. Perhaps it is the temperature. The clock showed 82 minutes until service. Velinir stood beside her, watching. The junior cooks had gone quiet again, a different quiet than before, not the stunned silence of failure, but the held-breath silence of people watching someone they believe in fight through a wall. I can prepare a Velori dessert, Velinir said. Standard diplomatic, the envoy may. No. Alara's voice was flat, quiet, the voice of someone who has made a decision. If we serve him a Velori dessert after 6 Selethri courses, it's like ending a symphony with a doorbell. It has to resolve. The whole meal has to land. She closed her eyes. She thought about desserts. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of vanilla and warm milk and toasted sugar. She thought about the way a perfect dessert feels, not just sweet, but complete. The meal's last breath. The final note that tells you the story is over and it ended well. She opened her eyes and reached for a container she hadn't used, a Selethri sweetener derived from a crystallized tree sap, amber gold and fragrant. The Velori had imported it for the summit and then set it aside because they couldn't work with it. It was volatile. It changed character at different temperatures. At room temperature it was cloyingly sweet. Heated, it became bitter. But chilled, Alara had discovered this in the pantry and hadn't found a use for it until now. Chilled. It turned floral and light, with a high clear note like a bell. She ground the crystallized sap to powder between her palms and dissolved it in a cold mineral water base. The sweetness vanished. In its place was something delicate and luminous, a high, singing note that reminded her of the way sunlight looks when it comes through water. She added the mineral salt, just a whisper, and the note deepened, gained body, became a voice instead of a sound. Then she reached for the Kelth root and hesitated. The standard ratio was wrong, too heavy. She needed the undertone but lighter, airier breathing. She took a piece no bigger than her thumbnail and instead of crushing it, she shaved it. Thin curls, almost translucent, that she laid onto the surface of the chilled preparation like petals on water. The fermented root released its compound slowly into the cold liquid, not all at once but in waves, and the undertone that emerged was not a drone but a pulse, a gentle oscillation, the bass note breathing. The kitchen was absolutely still. Every cook was watching her hands. Alara tasted the dessert. The 3 notes sounded in her mouth, the high singing sweetness of the chilled sap, the quiet body of the mineral salt, and the slow pulse of the Kelth root undertone, rising and falling like a tide. It was not just a dessert. It was a resolution, the final chord of a 7-course meal, and it resolved the way a piece of music resolves when the last note is exactly the one you needed to hear. She set the tasting vessel down. She allowed herself one nod, not a celebration, because you don't celebrate in someone else's kitchen. You put the dish up and you move on. Velinir tasted it. She was quiet for a long time. How did you know to shave the Kelth root instead of crushing it? She asked. Because cold preparations need the undertone to breathe. If you crush it, the compounds release all at once and the note is flat. If you shave it, they release in waves, vibrato instead of sustain. This is not in the index. No, ma'am, it's in the food. They plated. The plating took an hour by itself. 7 courses, each one reconstructed around Alara's undertone architecture, each one a full Selethri triad. Velinir ran the line with the precise discipline she'd maintained through every service of her career, calling out plates, checking temperatures, inspecting presentations. But the energy in the kitchen had changed. Where the previous 9 attempts had felt like desperation dressed in technique, this one felt like a kitchen cooking with purpose. He then worked his station with a quiet intensity that Alara recognized, the focus of a young cook who has caught a glimpse of what the craft actually is and wants to stay close to it. Davarin moved between stations like a veteran quartermaster, making sure every ingredient Alara needed was measured, prepped, and waiting before she reached for it. Even Sarath and the other junior cook who had been eyeing the exits were working with a concentration that bordered on reverence, as if the food they were helping plate might be the most important thing they ever touched. Velanir's technique gave the plates precision and elegance. Alara's instinct gave them soul. Where those two things met, in the careful arrangement of the third course's oil-brushed protein, in the measured restraint of the fourth course's stripped-down architecture, in the delicate shaved kelth root floating on the dessert's cold surface, the food became something more than either of them could have produced alone. The plates went out on the hour, carried by service staff in white formal tunics, each course timed to Alara's specifications, especially the third, which needed to reach the table within 4 minutes of final preparation. Velanir had briefed the service team personally, and they moved with the urgency of people who understood that the timing was not a preference but a requirement. And then the kitchen fell into the particular silence of a crew that has done everything it can, and now has nothing left to do but wait. Alara went back to the sanitation station. She picked up a utensil she'd been cleaning, realized it was already clean, and set it in the rack. Then she leaned against the counter and crossed her arms and waited. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips, the same fingertips that had crushed kelth root and shaved it thin and brushed diluted paste onto raw protein with the delicacy of a painter. The adrenaline was still there, sustaining her across the threshold of exhaustion, and she let it carry her because there was nothing else to do now except stand here and listen to the silence and hope that the food spoke for itself. The first course came back empty. Not just tasted, empty. The consomme vessel had been tilted and drained, every drop consumed, the crystal side still carrying the faintest copper sheen from the undertone base. The service staff set it on the return counter and said nothing, but their expressions said enough. Their eyes were wide with the particular astonishment of people who have carried 9 rejected plates to this counter, and are now looking at the first empty one. He then let out a breath he'd been holding. His hands were gripping the edge of his workstation so hard that his pale blue-white knuckles had gone almost translucent. The second course came back empty. The grain vessel had been scraped clean, not politely finished, but scraped, the way you scrape a dish when the food is too good to leave even a trace. Davarin looked at Alara and gave her one slow nod. It was a weighty nod, the kind of acknowledgement a veteran cook gives when he knows he has just witnessed something he won't see again. The third came back empty, and the service staff member paused at the door, actually stopped walking, and turned back to face the kitchen. The envoy closed his eyes on the second bite, she said. He held it in his mouth for 11 seconds. His aide says he hasn't done that since a state dinner on his homeworld 12 years ago. 11 seconds. Alara knew what that meant. She had watched enough people eat over the years to know that when someone closes their eyes and holds food in their mouth, it means the food has stopped being fuel and become experience. The envoy wasn't just tasting the dish. He was living inside it. Velanir's fingers tightened on the edge of her terminal. Her expression hadn't changed, but Alara could see the faintest luminous pulse in the skin beneath her jaw. A physiological tell that the Velori couldn't suppress, the equivalent of a human's throat tightening with emotion. The fourth course, the stripped-down centerpiece, 4 voices instead of 7, the dish that had nearly ended the collaboration before it found its footing, came back empty. The vessel was clean, and with it came a message, delivered by the envoy's personal aide, A tall Selethri woman in formal bronze who stood in the kitchen doorway and spoke with the careful precision of someone delivering diplomatic correspondence. The envoy asks the name of the chef. Velinir looked at Ilara. Ilara looked at the floor. "Tell him it was a collaborative effort," Velinir said. The aide left. The kitchen was quiet for a beat, and then he said, very quietly, "He asked for the name, chef, not for a committee." Velinir gave him a look that could have frozen plasma, but Ilara saw the corner of her mouth twitch, just once, before the professional composure reasserted itself. The fifth came back empty. The service staff member said, "The envoy's aide asked which Selethri-trained culinary scholar has been brought to the station. He recognizes the undertone technique as native level." The kitchen went quiet. Velinir's expression did something complicated. "There is no Selethri-trained scholar," Velinir said. "The undertone technique was developed here." The aide looked skeptical but left. The sixth course, the palate bridge, the barely there whisper of undertone, went out, came back empty, and a different message arrived. The envoy states that the palate course achieved a subtlety he has not encountered outside the formal dining halls of his capital. He formally requests to meet the culinary artist responsible. Velinir stood very still. She looked at Ilara, standing at the sanitation counter in her gray coveralls, arms crossed, her rough hands visible, her burned scar visible, her short dark hair flat with steam and sweat from 11 hours of work. Ilara did not look like a culinary artist. She looked like what she was, someone who washed dishes and cooked food and worked with her hands until the work was done. "The culinary artist," Velinir said, and her voice was steady and clear, "is the human sanitation worker standing at the wash station. Her name is Ilara Dunn. She developed the undertone base that restructured every course you serve tonight, and she did it in a storage pantry after her sanitation shift using ingredients your kitchen computer could not make sing. Now please deliver the seventh course before it loses its oscillation." The dessert went out. The kitchen waited. Ilara stayed at her station and tried to keep her breathing steady. The dessert came back empty. The crystal vessel had been drained to the last drop, and resting in the bottom was a small object, a Selethri honor token, a thumb-sized disc of dark bronze inscribed with geometric patterns. The aide who carried it stood at the kitchen entrance and spoke in a voice that carried across the room. "The Selethri envoy presents his personal culinary honor to the chef responsible for this evening's banquet. He states that the 7 courses achieved a tonal flavor architecture that honored the deepest traditions of Selethri cuisine, while introducing a harmonic sensibility he has never encountered. He states that whoever prepared this meal does not merely understand Selethri food, they understand food itself, at a level that transcends species. He wishes to invite the chef to his table." 23 Velori cooks, the service staff, Velinir the aide, all looking at Ilara. Ilara looked at the honor token. She looked at Velinir. Velinir's expression had settled into something clear and certain, the look of a head chef who knows exactly what just happened and who isn't fighting it. "Go," Velinir said. "I'm not dressed for." "Go as you are," he asked for the cook, not the uniform. Ilara uncrossed her arms. She looked down at her coveralls, stained, wrinkled, smelling of cleaning solvent and kelth root, and 11 hours of work. She looked at her hands, rough, scarred, the hands of someone who had been washing dishes and cooking food and hauling crates since she was old enough to reach a stove. She picked up the honor token from the dessert vessel. It was warm. It hummed faintly against her palm, the same resonance she had learned to hear in the food, the same vibration she had been chasing through every course, the same frequency that had been living in her fingertips since her grandmother first put a wooden spoon in her hand and said, "Listen." She walked out of the kitchen and down the corridor toward the ambassador's table. The corridor was long and quiet, pale crystal walls lined with soft amber light panels, the floor polished to a mirror finish that reflected her gray coveralls and rough boots as she walked. She passed two service staff members heading the other direction, and they stepped aside without being asked, pressing their backs to the wall the way people do when someone unexpected has just become important. Alara did not feel important. She felt tired and slightly overwhelmed and aware of a faint tremor in her hands that she recognized not as fear, but as the adrenaline drop that comes after 11 hours of focused work. She had felt it at Marchetti's, on busy nights when the last table's dessert went out and she finally had a moment to lean against the pass and breathe. The body's way of saying, "You held it together. You can let go now." Not yet, one more course to serve, the one that was not on a plate. The dining hall of Diplomatic Station Corinthia opened before her, a vaulted chamber of pale crystal and soft light. Warm amber from the overhead panels, cool blue from the crystal walls, the two colors meeting in the air like a chord. The ceiling arched 30 feet above, hung with crystal fixtures that scattered the light into soft prismatic patterns on the polished floor. It was, Alara thought, exactly the kind of room that made a person in gray coveralls feel very small. But she had spent her whole life in rooms that weren't designed for people like her, lecture halls at the community college in Shearwater, where she'd emptied trash cans beside whiteboards covered in equations, the officer's dining room on transport vessel Gareth, where she'd served meals during her transit, the grand hall of Corinthia itself, which she'd mopped 100 times without ever sitting in one of its chairs. She knew how to walk through a room that didn't belong to her. You walked the same way you walked through your own kitchen, steady, purposeful, knowing what you came to do. The Celethri delegation sat at a long table of dark wood, 8 of them, tall and bronze-skinned with sharp angular features and eyes the color of old amber. They wore formal dress, dark fabrics with geometric embroidery in deep bronze and copper threads, the patterns intricate and precise, reminiscent of the same mathematical harmonics that their cuisine was built on. The table was set with crystal stemware and the empty plates and vessels from 7 courses, all drained, all finished, arranged in the careful sequence of a meal that had been consumed with attention and intention. At the head of the table sat the envoy, a man of perhaps 60 standard years, with a deep-lined face and the quiet authority of someone who has represented his people across 100 star systems. His name, Alara knew from overheard conversations in the kitchen, was Haloran Devanthy. He looked up when she entered. His expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. He had expected a tall Valori in formal chef's whites. He got a short human woman in gray coveralls, with a burned scar and rough hands and steam-flat hair. Alara stopped 3 paces from the table. She held the honor token in her right hand. She did not know the Celethri protocols for this moment, so she did what she always did. She stood straight, met the envoy's eyes, and waited. "You are the chef," the envoy said. His voice was deep, textured, carrying the same harmonic quality that Alara had learned to hear in his species' food. "I'm a cook, sir. The chef is Velanir. She designed the flavor architecture for every course. I provided the undertone base." "You provided the soul," the envoy said. "The difference is not small." He studied her for a moment, the burned scar, the rough hands, the coveralls, the wooden utensil still tucked into her waistband like a carpenter who forgot to put down the pencil. "How does a human taste the undertone? Your species lacks the secondary palate." "I don't taste it, sir. I feel it, as texture, as vibration. My grandmother taught me to listen to food, and if you listen closely enough, you can hear things your tongue can't measure." The envoy was quiet. Around the table, his delegation watched with the focused attention of people witnessing something they would remember for a long time. One of them, a woman with silver-threaded bronze hair and the precise gaze of someone who catalogs everything she sees, had set down her glass and was studying Alara's hands with undisguised interest. "Your 4th course," the envoy said. "The centerpiece. It was 4 voices, not 7. Alara blinked. She had not expected him to identify the structure that precisely. "Yes, sir. The original design had 7. I could taste the ghost of the others, the elements that were removed. The decision to strip the dish was deliberate. He leaned forward slightly. Why 4? Because 7 voices were competing. They were each excellent, but together they created a wall. 4 voices, each doing something different, produce more complexity than 7 voices doing the same thing louder. She paused, reaching for the right analogy. A quartet is harder to write than a symphony, sir. Every note has to earn its place because there's nowhere to hide. The envoy's expression changed. It was a small change, a deepening around the eyes, a slight softening of the sharp angular features. But Alara saw it and recognized it because she had seen the same expression on Sal Marchetti's face on the rare occasions when a new cook said something that revealed they understood food at the level where technique becomes philosophy. On my homeworld, the envoy said, we have a word Valenthar. It means one who hears the deep note. It is the highest compliment our cuisine recognizes. It is given to cooks who understand not just the how of food, but the why, cooks who know that the purpose of a meal is not to demonstrate skill, but to make the person eating it feel understood. In 1,000 years of interstellar contact, we have never applied it to a non-Selethri. He paused. Tonight I apply it to you. Alara felt the word settle over her the way a warm kitchen settles into your bones at the end of a long shift, not with fanfare, not with ceremony, but with the quiet certainty of being exactly where you belong. It was the same feeling she'd had the first time Sal Marchetti watched her finish a risotto and said, without looking up from his own station, "That's right. Keep doing it exactly like that." The feeling of being seen by someone who knows what they're looking at. "Thank you, sir," she said. "Sit, eat with us. Tell me about this place on earth where you learned to listen." She pulled out a chair. The wood was warm under her hands. Marchetti's, 40 seats, open kitchen, corner of Vine and Harbor Street. Shearwater earth. What did they serve? Italian simple food. Pasta, risotto, grilled fish, bread, nothing complicated. And yet, you learn to hear the deep note from simple food. Simple food is the hardest kind to cook, sir. When you only have 3 ingredients, every one of them has to be perfect. There's no sauce to hide behind, no garnish to distract from the protein. It's just the food, and it's either right or it isn't. My grandmother used to make a soup with 4 ingredients: water, onion, bread, and oil. 4 ingredients. And it was the best thing I've ever eaten before or since, because every one of them was exactly what it needed to be, and together they did something that none of them could do alone. She paused. That's what the undertone is. It's the thing that happens when the parts become more than the sum. The envoy nodded slowly. The woman with silver-threaded hair reached across the table and poured something into a glass, a tall crystal vessel filled with liquid that was amber and faintly luminous. She set it in front of Alara. "Drink," the envoy said, "and tell me if you can hear it." Alara lifted the glass. The liquid was warm. She held it close and breathed in. The aroma was layered, complex, carrying the same triadic structure she'd been building into the food all night. She tasted it. 3 notes sounded in her mouth. A bright top note, a steady middle, and beneath them both, deep and sustained, the undertone humming like a heartbeat. "The bass note is sustained," she said, "not oscillating. This is a savory pairing. It would go with your 3rd or 4th course, not the dessert." Around the table, the Selethri delegation exchanged glances. The woman with silver-threaded hair actually smiled. "She hears it," the woman said to the envoy, "perfectly." Alara told them about Marchetti's, about the risotto that took 40 minutes and the bread that took 3 hours and the grilled fish that took exactly as long as it needed and not 1 second more. She told them about Sal Marchetti, who could tell when a sauce was done by the sound it made in the pan, and about his wife Maria, who ran the front of house and could read a dining room the way a conductor reads an orchestra, knowing which table needed attention, which table needed to be left alone, which table was about to have the best meal of their lives and didn't know it yet. She told them about her grandmother, who cooked by feel and by love, and by the accumulated wisdom of 100,000 meals prepared for people she cared about. The Cella3 listened the way people listen when they recognize something true, leaning in, quiet, asking questions that showed they understood what she was really saying. Behind her, through the dining hall's open doors, she could see the kitchen corridor. Veloneer was standing in the doorway, watching. She had changed out of her chef's whites into a simple tunic, and her expression was the one Alara recognized from every kitchen she had ever worked in, the look of a head chef watching a cook she had underestimated do exactly what needed doing. Veloneer inclined her head. One small nod. The nod of a professional acknowledging a professional. Alara nodded back. The trade summit convened the next morning. Alara was not present. She was in the kitchen, running the sanitation shift that was still technically her assignment, scrubbing the formal service vessels from the previous night's banquet and thinking about the way the chilled sap sweetener had performed, and whether a warmer variant might work for a Cella3 breakfast preparation. The summit happened above her, in the conference levels of the station, in rooms she had never entered and never would, and she was fine with that. She was a cook, not a diplomat. Her work was done the moment the food left the kitchen. What happened after that, the treaties, the commerce, the political architecture of three-system alliances, was someone else's job. But word filtered down the way it always does in a station, through the service staff, through the junior cooks, through the maintenance workers who cleaned the conference rooms. The Cella3 envoy had opened the session by commending the station's hospitality and specifically referencing the previous evening's banquet as evidence that the Velori understood the value of listening, not just in diplomacy, he said, but in the things that matter more than diplomacy. He had used the word Valenthar in his opening statement, in front of the full diplomatic assembly, and the Velori translators had struggled with it because the concept didn't have a direct equivalent in their language. They settled on one who understands the unspoken dimension of craft. It was close enough. The trade agreement was signed by noon. 900 billion in annual commerce, secured by 7 plates of food. Commander Rithvan, the man who had walked into the kitchen 14 hours before the banquet and demanded a solution, sent a formal commendation to Veloneer's office that afternoon. The commendation named the kitchen staff collectively. It did not mention Alara by name, because Commander Rithvan did not know Alara's name, because Alara was a sanitation auxiliary, and the commander did not read the sanitation staff roster. Veloneer read the commendation and set it aside. Then she submitted a different document, a formal request to the station commander for the immediate reclassification of Alara done from mess hall auxiliary to culinary specialist, with full kitchen access and a permanent station on the line. The request included Veloneer's detailed notes from the 11-hour cooking session, the specific undertone ratios Alara had developed, and a single sentence that Alara would not read until months later. This station's kitchen has been operating at 2/3 capacity since it opened. The missing third was standing at the sanitation counter. The request was approved within the hour, expedited by a personal note from the Cella3 envoy's office indicating that any future diplomatic functions involving his delegation would require Alara's involvement. Commander Rithvan, reading the approval, looked up the sanitation staff roster for the first time. He found Alara's name, her species designation, her labor classification, her 14-month tenure. He made a note on his datapad and said nothing, because a commander who has just avoided a 900 billion credit diplomatic failure does not need to say anything. He just signs the form. Alara received the reclassification notice on her datapad while she was cleaning the floor grates in Section 3. She read it twice. She looked at the words culinary specialist and felt them land the way the undertone landed in a Cella3 dish, not on the surface, but deep, in the place where things that matter settle and stay. She set the datapad on the counter and finished the floor grates, because the floor grates needed finishing and a job half done is a job not done, and then she went to the kitchen. She put on a clean tunic, the pale blue velour kitchen tunic, not her gray sanitation coveralls, and the difference in weight and texture against her shoulders was more significant than she had expected, and took her place at the station Velinir had assigned her. Third position on the line between Heathen and Davarin, with a full set of tools and a workstation of her own. Heathen looked at her. "Welcome to the line, chef." Elara picked up a knife, a proper one, balanced and sharp, the first real kitchen knife she'd held in 14 months. It felt like coming home. "I'm not a chef," she said. "I'm a cook." She began to prep for the evening service. The kelth root was waiting, dark and pungent, and full of the deep note that only a few people in the galaxy could hear. She took it in her hands, felt the familiar resonance in her fingertips, and started to work. The kitchen hummed around her. Not the ambient hum of machines and ventilation, but the real hum. The sound a kitchen makes when every station is working, every cook is in rhythm, and the food is doing what it was meant to do. It was the same sound Marchetti's had made on a Good Friday night, the same sound her grandmother's kitchen had made on Sunday mornings, the same sound that kitchens have made since the first person put food over fire and thought, "I can make this better." Elara listened to it, and she cooked.